A boy born to become a king, a woman he loved and lost and found again, and nearly 8 decades of waiting. This is the story of how Charles Philip Arthur George became King Charles III, and how Camilla Rosemary Shand became his queen. Charles arrived at Buckingham Palace on the 14th of November 1948, the first child of Princess Elizabeth and Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. He was born into a family whose private life had already been swallowed by public duty, and that pattern would define his entire childhood. When he was barely a toddler, his father's naval postings took the family to Malta, and young Charles was frequently left in London in the care of nannies and grandparents while his parents lived abroad. A sister, Anne, joined him within a year, and the two were opposites from the start. Charles cautious and inward, Anne loud and fearless, yet they grew close, simply because they had no one else who understood what it meant to grow up half royal, half orphaned by circumstance. Everything changed in 1952. Charles's grandfather, King George VI, died suddenly at just 56, and Charles's mother became Queen Elizabeth II. He watched her crowned at Westminster Abbey as a small boy in a page's role, not fully grasping that the woman being anointed was also the mother he rarely saw. Overnight, Charles became heir apparent, inheriting a string of titles that stretched back centuries: Duke of Cornwall, Duke of Rothesay, Earl of Carrick, Lord of the Isles, along with the vast Duchy of Cornwall estate, a property and investment portfolio founded in 1337 specifically to fund the monarch's eldest son. It remains worth well over $1 billion today, but as a child, Charles understood none of that. What he understood was that his mother was now busier than ever, and that the affection he craved from her was in short supply. Biographers and historians have long described Charles's childhood as lonely. His parents tried in their own way to shape him into the kind of king they believed Britain needed, which for Philip meant toughening him up. At 8, Charles was sent away to boarding school, breaking with royal tradition of private tutors at home. A few years later, Philip enrolled him at his own old school, Gordonstown, in the Scottish Highlands, a place built around cold showers, early runs, and the idea that hardship built character. For Charles, it built something closer to isolation. Classmates were wary of getting too close to the future king, and the ones who tried were mocked by others for currying favor. He would later call his years there coldits in kilts, a joke with a real ache behind it. There was one attempt at a gentler bond in these early years that never quite worked. When Charles was about 4, his mother tried sharing her own great love horses with her son, hoping riding together might draw them closer. Charles found the large, fast animals frightening rather than thrilling, and the experiment quietly fizzled, one more small missed connection between a busy queen and a sensitive boy. When Charles turned 12, his parents, more settled into their roles by then, had 2 more children, Andrew and Edward, and by most accounts gave them a warmer, more present upbringing than Charles and Anne had known. It was a small but telling shift, and one Charles noticed. Academically, he was never considered brilliant, and he later admitted he'd had little say in shaping his own life. Even his childhood friendships were, to a degree, arranged for him by others. Still, he pressed on to Trinity College, Cambridge, where he studied archaeology, anthropology, and history, eventually becoming the first heir to the throne to earn a university degree. He spent a term in Australia, which is often credited with loosening him up socially, and another stretch in Wales, where he crammed to learn enough of the language for his televised investiture as Prince of Wales in 1969, a title granted to heirs since the 13th century. From there, following family expectation rather than personal passion, he joined the Royal Navy. His relatives reportedly encouraged him to enjoy his bachelor years before eventually settling down with a suitable, aristocratic bride, someone chosen as much for pedigree as for compatibility. Even a visiting American president, Richard Nixon, once tried his hand at matchmaking, hoping to interest Charles in his daughter Tricia during a trip to Washington. Charles wasn't interested. His attention, even then, kept drifting back to one particular young woman. Camilla Rosemary Shand was born on the 17th of July, 1947, in London, less than 2 years before Charles. Her father, Bruce Shand, was a decorated army officer who later ran a wine business. Her mother, Rosalind, was the daughter of a baron. Family lore held a curious royal thread of its own. Camilla's great-grandmother, Alice Keppel, had been a well-known mistress of King Edward VII decades earlier, a detail that would later strike people as almost too fitting given how her life would unfold. Camilla grew up comfortably between a country estate in Sussex and a townhouse in Kensington, alongside a younger sister, Annabel, and a brother, Mark. By most accounts, hers was a happy, secure childhood, quite different from the one Charles was living through at the same time. She was an enthusiastic reader and was encouraged early on to take her own interests seriously, later taking writing lessons as a teenager. She was sent to finishing school in Switzerland, studied French in Paris for a spell, and came out as a debutante in London in the mid-1960s, the traditional presentation ritual for young women of her class. Afterward, she worked briefly as a secretary and was reportedly let go from one job after one too many late arrivals following nights out dancing, an early sign of the more relaxed, unpretentious personality that would later distinguish her from other royal figures. In the late 1960s, she began a relationship with a cavalry officer named Andrew Parker Bowles, an on-and-off romance that ran for several years before it fizzled out around 1970, after which Parker Bowles began seeing Charles's sister, Princess Anne. Camilla and the royal family were already moving in overlapping social circles by the time she was formally introduced to Charles in 1971. The two hit it off quickly, and by 1973, their families had met. That same year, Charles was sent overseas with the Navy, and the relationship ended abruptly, and for reasons that have never been fully agreed upon. Accounts differ on whether Charles simply wasn't ready to commit, or whether the split was engineered by relatives who didn't see Camilla as future queen material. His great-uncle, Lord Mountbatten, reportedly favored his own granddaughter for the role, while the Queen Mother had her sights on the Spencer family. Within months of the breakup, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles in a Catholic ceremony attended by several senior royals, including the Queen Mother herself. She and Parker Bowles went on to have 2 children, Tom and Laura. In 1979, Lord Mountbatten was assassinated by the IRA, a loss that devastated Charles, and it was Camilla, by then married to someone else, he turned to for comfort. Their bond quietly deepened even as both remained married to other people, an arrangement that, by several accounts, both spouses were aware of and tolerated in their own ways. By the early 1980s, pressure was mounting on Charles, now in his 30s, to marry someone suitable, young, aristocratic, and untouched by scandal. Lady Diana Spencer fit the description precisely. 13 years his junior, she came from a noble family with roots stretching back to the 15th century, and she was, by every outward measure, the ideal bride for a future king. What she and Charles lacked was any real emotional connection. Theirs was, from the outset, a partnership built more on suitability than affection. They married on the 29th of July, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral, in a ceremony watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. Diana's dress, with its enormous train, became instantly iconic, as did the historic Spencer family tiara she wore. But the fairy tale imagery masked a marriage already under strain. Charles reportedly spent much of the honeymoon on the royal yacht, absorbed in his own thoughts, and not long after the couple settled into life at Kensington Palace in Highgrove, he resumed his relationship with Camilla. Their first son, William, was born in June 1982, and Diana struggled afterward with what would now be recognized as postpartum depression, compounded by the intense scrutiny of public life and a marriage that offered little support. She and baby William nonetheless joined Charles on a landmark tour of Australia and New Zealand, where Diana became an unexpected sensation. Crowds gathered for her, and newspapers ran her photograph on nearly every front page, often relegating Charles to a secondary role in coverage of his own tour. It was an adjustment he reportedly found difficult. Their second son, Harry, arrived in September 1984, during what Diana would later describe as one of the more stable periods of their marriage, a stability that didn't last. Diana made a point of raising her sons differently than royal tradition dictated. She chose their names herself, dismissed the nanny the palace had selected in favor of her own, and insisted William and Harry attend school alongside other children rather than being tutored in isolation at the palace, as generations of royals had been before them. She took them to school herself when she could, read to them, and made time for ordinary affection in a way Charles, raised almost entirely by nannies himself, had never really experienced and struggled to replicate. As the 1980s wore on, Diana's popularity soared while the marriage crumbled quietly behind palace walls. Reports of coldness between the couple began surfacing in the press, and when news broke publicly of Charles's affair, public opinion turned sharply against both him and Camilla, a reputational wound that, for Charles, took decades to heal. Camilla divorced Andrew Parker Bowles in 1994. Charles and Diana divorced in 1996. Diana continued her charitable work and remained devoted to her sons until August 1997, when she was killed in a car crash in Paris while being pursued by photographers. The public grief that followed was overwhelming, and the royal family's initially muted, procedural response, in contrast to Charles's own visible sorrow as a father, drew lasting criticism of the institution as a whole.